Foreword. Hello and welcome back to this, the fourth entry in my video series on Final Fantasy Tactics. For those of you who haven't watched the earlier entries, the first video explores the state of the peasantry and the rebellion which forms the backstory of the game. The second video examines the structure and function of the Church of Glabados. And the third video looks at the state of the major aristocratic houses and their role in the game's narrative. They don't have to be watched in any particular order, however, I would suggest watching them before you watch this video, as it will build on and examine several elements discussed throughout. This video is actually the original video I wanted to make about the game, but when I sat down to start writing, I discovered there was a lot more I wanted to examine beyond the topic I'll be discussing now, which is the concept of historical revisionism. It's my hope that by examining how the meta-narrative and the narrative itself approach and interrogate the idea of historical revisionism, we can come to see how the game's representation tracks with both popular and academic perspectives, as well as how the present shapes our understanding of the past. Some reminders. This video will contain spoilers for the entirety of Final Fantasy Tactics, so do yourself a favor and play it if you haven't already. I will also be relying on the text from the War of the Lions version of the game, as it presents a more faithful adaptation of the original Japanese. With this information in mind, let's get started. Welcome back to the struggle, comrades. Arazlam's Quest. In the original version of the game, the opening cutscene focused on a crudely rendered unit of chocobo-mounted knights trampling their way across the countryside. It was 1997. Cut them some slack. In the War of the Lions version, this has been replaced by focusing primarily on Delita, but is prefaced with a man moving about in a library. He lights a small oil lamp and unfurls a large scroll, revealing a faded map of Ivalice. As her camera begins to descend into the map, the topography of medieval Ivalice begins to spring up around us. This individual, Arazlam Durai, is the narrator and our true point of view character. The opening cutscene very firmly establishes our primary framing device, being the assistant to our historian, and assisting him with his task, which is sitting and poring over some primary text. If you've watched the first video in this series, you may recall that the final segment was a brief discussion of the reliability of Arazlam as our POV character, so I won't rehash that here. It will, however, help to keep in mind that while Arazlam is our primary POV character, that you as the player also have your own perspective, something the narrative does its best to incorporate into some of the mechanical aspects of the game. Ultimately, your role as historian is no less important than Arazlam, and so your perspective and feelings are a component in the game's story. That you, nevertheless, are forced to rely on Ramza, as he is the sole character that you cannot dismiss, also lends credence to my own assertion about a particular aspect of the game. One of the elements which is, regrettably, left unmentioned and needs to be inferred is what document, or set of documents, Arazlam is working from to write his current text, the Zodiac Brave story. The assumption is that he is relying on the Durai papers, as they are referenced during the opening text dump. In the Final Fantasy Wiki, it also states, in the CGI cel-shaded scenes, he gets the map of Ivalice and reads the Durai papers before the scene changes to 400 years ago, where Delita, along with his group, are heading to Orban. The problem here is that, according to the text which appears in his Persona entry, he had already published a text called The Durai Papers 400 Years of Truth, which was listed as a classic. So while it states that the Durai papers were only discovered by the public this last year, we need to understand that Arazlam, an archaeologist and theologian, is not the general public. So my reading is that there is some unnamed additional primary source which he relies upon to flesh out the details provided by the Durai papers. Some journal or other account of events left by Ramza would almost certainly be the simplest choice. This is inference because the text is not clear, but I believe the fact that the framing is set out the way that it is strongly suggests this to be the case. When you enter the menu and access the Chronicle option, it opens to Arazlam stating, "Careful study of these works will no doubt shed light on the secrets behind the War of the Lions." If you then select the Events option, you will be taken to a page with a summary of a narrative event, and then will be able to rewatch an FMV or sequence of dialogue. What is quite telling is that all of the summaries are written in the first-person perspective, in Ramza's voice. Which makes sense when you consider that Arazlam has no other means by which to observe the events of the past, and there must be some means of accounting for the many events which Oren was not present to observe or receive testimony of. Oren had no account of what happened to Ramza and co. following their departure from Fort Besselat, and save for a brief glimpse, he never encounters them again. As far as the Orthodox historical account is concerned, Ramza, Alma, and your entire party had perished in some fashion. The text is not clear about how the authorities confirmed the deaths of these characters, so some inference is required. Narratively, there almost certainly would have been witnesses to Ramza and company storming Orban, so this is where the Orthodox historical narrative would have ended. Ramza and the Knights Templar killed each other in their struggle within Orban, and Alma was, for whatever reason, an innocent who was also killed, as she was still provided a proper burial, whereas this was denied to Ramza. I wonder again, as the text does not say one way or another, if the Church of Glabados revealed the murder of the High Confessor and blamed it on Ramza, or if they simply covered it up as the involvement of the Template was too close to reveal to the general populace. For our investigative perspective, once Ramza and co. have traveled through the portal into the lost sacred precincts, the gateway is destroyed and we are told that there is no way back. The last we see of Ramza and his party is being engulfed by the explosion of the airship following the defeat of Ultima. So, we have every reason to believe that most of the other characters were killed in this explosion, and only Ramza and Alma survived. Again, because the text is unclear on this, it is of course possible that the other characters survived as well. I would argue, however, that the few clues we are provided with in the post-game sequences, or in asking if Orlando died fighting bravely, Ovilia's fate, and the utter surprise of Oren seeing Ramza and Alma ride by on chocobos, leans heavily into the other characters being killed, or at the very least, trapped within the Necrol. So why is what amounts to fan speculation about the ending of the game important to our discussion? Well, we do establish that Ramza and Alma have survived, and while they are never seen again, it leaves open a direct narrative line to support my argument that the primary text we are investigating is not the Durai papers, but rather some record left by Ramza, or even Alma, chronicling their part in the War of the Lions. This is, after all, the kind of document which forms the basis of good historical revisionism. But before I elaborate on this, it will be worthwhile to first interrogate the orthodox history of the War of the Lions and the underlying historiographical framework which characterized it. The Great Man Theory of History. The parallel narrative structure of Final Fantasy Tactics is central to the way the story is told because it reinforces the meta-narrative of the player's role as historian. By having the narrative elements center on the dual, but simultaneous, experiences of Ramza and Delita, the player is made to experience both the orthodox history and the revisionist history at the same time. Obviously, primacy is given to the revisionist perspective, as Ramza is the protagonist of the game, but that we are nevertheless able to also see the events centered on Delita is significant. The established history of the War of the Lions, what can be called the orthodox interpretation of the historic events, centers on the fall of the aristocracy and the ascension of Delita Hyrule. As the narrative progresses and the plot develops its own flow, we are present for the moments when Delita and Ramza's narratives overlap, but, importantly, we are also there for the moments central to Delita's story. This narrative element was, apparently, deemed significant enough by the developers of the War of the Lions that an entire new battle and additional scenes of dialogue have been added to flesh out his character. We are told in the preamble of Chapter 1 that Delita's name first appears in the historic record 1 year prior to the outbreak of the War of the Lions, as he is included in the graduation roll of the Garland Military Academy. Orphaned son of a tenant farmer on the Beolv Manse, he and his sister Titra are raised by the Beolvs, and he becomes friends with Ramza. It's significant that Delita is part of your team during Chapter 1 because this is the point where he is forced to face the realities of Ivalisan society, something both he and Ramza had been sheltered from. His interactions with Argath, the abduction of his sister, and his role in putting down the rebellion of the Corpse Brigade come to a head when Titra is shot by Argath during the siege of Zichton Fortress. Delita is able to avenge his sister's death, but is presumed dead, being engulfed in the explosion which brings the siege to an end. I've discussed this at length in the first video, but I cannot overstress the importance of the tragedy at Zichton Fortress because it serves as the inciting incident for both Delita and Ramza. What each comes away with and carries with them into the future comes to dominate their reactions to the events which play out before them. I'm going to focus on the very basic narrative beats of what would amount to the orthodox version of events because I'll touch on the history as we learn it through the playthrough in the next section. Following the tragedy at Zichton Fortress, Delita becomes a holy knight in the service of the Black Ram Knights under Baron Grimms. Delita is dispatched by the Baron to investigate rumors of a plot by Queen Luviria to abduct Princess Ovilia in order to remove her as a contender to the throne. Delita intervenes and abducts the princess himself in order to protect her. He is caught by forces from the Order of the Northern Sky, but with the help of Ramza, is able to defeat them, and he leaves the princess in the care of Ramza and company. Delita escorts the princess from Lionel to Zeltenia, but is ambushed at Zirikili Falls, and is forced to single-handedly fight off their attackers. Delita and Ovilia arrive at Zeltenia, and Delita reveals that Chancellor Glavain was plotting with the Queen and executes him. He is appointed as head of the Black Ram Knights. Duke Ultana places the Queen under arrest and crowns Ovilia as Queen. Duke Larg crowns Prince Ornis as king and moves to free the Queen from her imprisonment. The War of the Lions breaks out. Delita and Ovilia develop a romantic relationship, and he pledges his life to her service. They fall in love. Delita and the High Confessor expose a plot to assassinate Duke Ultana, who in turn has Orlandu arrested for plotting treason. Delita is made a Knight Devout and given the leadership of the Order of the Southern Sky. Duke Larg is assassinated, and Dystark Beolv assumes the leadership of the Order of the Northern Sky and guardianship over King Ornis. During the siege of Fort Besilat, Duke Gultana is assassinated by Orlandu, who is in turn executed by Delita. Dystarg is murdered by his brother Zalbog, who is mortally wounded. Delita, through the mediation of the Church of Glabados, is able to assert the rule of Queen Ovilia, and the War of the Lions comes to an end. Delita and Ovilia are married, and he becomes the new King of Ivalice. Hailed as the hero of the War of the Lions, he has a long and prosperous reign. Delita's story, the orthodox version of history, fits very neatly in the historiographical framework commonly known as the Great Man Theory of History. The concept was popularized by Thomas Carlyle in his 1841 text on heroes, hero worship, and the heroic in history, a collection of essays based on a series of lectures he gave throughout 1840. The text makes a case that the driving force of history, the engine that progresses human civilization from epoch to epoch, are those individuals who are able to leverage their innate and learned abilities to their advantage, in Carlyle's own words. For, as I take it, universal history, the history of what man has accomplished in this world, is at bottom the history of the great men who have worked here. They were the leaders of men, these great ones, the modelers, patterns, and, in a wide sense, creators of whatsoever the general mass of men contrive to do or to attain. All things that we see standing accomplished in the world are properly the outer material result, the practical realization and embodiment of thoughts that dwelt in the great men sent into the world. The soul of the whole world's history, it may justly be considered, were the history of these. The great man theory of history was most influential during the 19th century and can be reflected in the works of philosophers and writers such as Hegel, Nietzsche, and slightly later historians such as Sidney Hook. It is true that the theory was heavily criticized in its own age, something I'll be discussing later on, but it maintained its influence in academia until the post-war era. There are even some contemporary historians who have argued that the theory is not without its merits, such as Darren McMahon. There is also something to the idea that while the theory lost significance in historiography, it found a new home in biography, albeit this can be overstated. Perhaps where the impact of the great man theory has had its most lasting influence is in the popular imagination. Modern visual media, especially those dealing with history, are replete with examples of the importance of great men, and, needs be said, women as well. This owes, in large part, to the necessity of centralizing a narrative in a coherent fashion so that audiences can follow along with it. As such, historical narrative fiction has the built-in function of overemphasizing the importance of the individual in history. In the context of the orthodox history of the War of the Lions, it is easy enough to witness the great man theory of history in action. If we apply Carlyle's framework to the critical analysis of the text, we can come to understand how this narrative emerged. In the final chapter of his text, titled "The Hero is King," Carlyle spends the lion's share discussing Oliver Cromwell. Speaking of Cromwell's humble origins, that such a man, with the eye to see, with the heart to dare, should advance from post to post, from victory to victory, till the Huntingdon farmer became, by whatever name you might call him, the acknowledged strongest man in England, virtually the King of England, requires no magic to explain it. Switch out a few words and this could very easily be a description of Delita's path from peasant squire to King of Ivalice. Now, with all of this said, anyone who has played the game knows that this is a very sanitized version of the events of the War of the Lions. So much so that it has to basically be reconstructed to observe it taking place in the narrative we are provided. After all, the entire point of the meta-narrative is to criticize and challenge this orthodox version of Ivalice in history. Arazlam proposes to accomplish this by switching the focus from the hero King Delita Hyrule to the heretic Ramza Beolv. Historical Revisionism. Final Fantasy Tactics thoroughly invests in the use of parallel narrative structures, but it would be more accurate to call these mirrored structures. As I argued in the Anarchy and Galleon video, because Delita and Ramza are currently serving the interests of the aristocracy, it is originally Ygraf who is the mirror of Ramza. Once, however, Delita re-enters the narrative, the game leans very heavily into taking every opportunity to juxtapose his development with Ramza's. So Delita's ascent and lies are opposed to Ramza's descent and truth. And the idea of the capital T truth is of the utmost importance as it relates to the meta-narrative. We are, after all, supposed to be on a quest for the truth. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to start rambling off about the nature of truth or epistemology. This video is going to be long enough as it is. No, it will be sufficient to simply state that the perspective we are presented with is a very common one, that it is possible to know the truth of the past if only we look in the right places. The term historical revisionism is a complex one because its meaning is very context dependent. The way the term is used academically as a general methodology is self-explanatory. Historical revisionism is the re-examination, re-evaluation, and revision of the orthodox or established view of a historical event, person, and so on. In this context, the process of revisionism is built into the study of history itself because the re-evaluation of the past based on the re-examination of past conclusions or the discovery of new historic documentation necessitates critical engagement with the orthodox position. There are some other academic contexts where historic revisionism is used in a different manner. For example, when speaking about the ongoing reticence of conservative elements of Japan who refuse to acknowledge the war crimes of the imperial military during the Second Sino-Japanese and Pacific Wars, these are referred to as revisionist positions. In Western academic historical discourse, this is generally compared to what is termed historical denialism, most commonly seen in discourse around the denial of historic genocides. Where the pejorative use of revisionism comes into the frame is in popular discussions of historic figures or events. The normal practice of critically examining and interpreting the past, and by doing so, dislodging more orthodox perspectives, is often criticized by conservative and reactionary elements. This is argued as an attack on tradition, erasing the past, dead white male bashing, and so on. But it is in effect little more than performative outrage because it agitates and upsets the established historic narrative, usually one that justifies the existing order. As a metatextual example, in 2018, blogger Gary Gray II published an entry called "What Arazlam Changed from the War of the Lions," itself based on a Reddit thread they published in 2016. The thesis boils down to Arazlam being a revisionist historian, trying to act in an effort to reform and restore the church, which doesn't make a lot of sense given how bad the church comes across, by vilifying Delita. It may very well be tongue-in-cheek, but it represents a more conservative interpretation, arguing for the veracity of the Orthodox history. So if we step back and examine the events of Final Fantasy Tactics as the game presents them, and compare this to the Orthodox timeline provided above, the revisionist narrative is obvious. Following the tragedy at Zeekton Fortress, Ramza abandons his name as Beolv, adopting his mother's surname, Lugria, and becomes a sellsword. He comes to work alongside the sellsword Gafgarion to escort the princess to the care of Duke Larg. Ovilia is kidnapped by Delita from Orban Monastery. Ramza learns of Duke Larg's plot to have the princess assassinated and chooses to fight against Gafgarion and the Order of the Northern Sky. Unsure of who he can trust, Ramza and the princess travel to Lionel, seeking the protection of the Church of Glabados. Ramza meets Mustadio Bunrasa and saves him from pursuit. They arrive at Lionel and encounter Cardinal Delacroix, who reveals the existence of the Orosite. It is revealed that Ovilia is not the real Ovilia, but was a replacement for the original who was assassinated in her youth. She grudgingly accepts the help of the church to seek the throne, and travels with Delita. It is revealed that Cardinal Delacroix is in fact a Lucavi and seeks the remaining Zodiac stones. Ramza kills him. The War of the Lions breaks out. Ramza meets Oran Durai. Ramza is pursued by Confessor Zalmor and is declared a heretic for the murder of Cardinal Delacroix by the Church. Alma Beolv is kidnapped by the Templar Isilud, while Ramza raids Orban Monastery seeking a zodiac stone. Ramza receives these scriptures of Germanique and discovers the High Confessor's plot as the true purpose of the War of the Lions. Ramza pursues Alma to Ryavain's castle, where he kills the Lukavi-possessed Wygraf. Alma is kidnapped by Templar Fulmarv, also revealed to be a Lukavi. Ramza travels to inform Count Orlandu of the church's plot. Orlandu joins him. Dukes Galtana and Larg are assassinated. Ramza travels to Limbury in pursuit of Alma. He kills the Lukavi-possessed Marquis de Limbury. Ramza travels to Igros to try to reveal the plot to his brother Dystarg. It is revealed that Dystarg murdered Barbaneth to become head of house and is killed by his brother Zalbog. Zalbog is killed in turn by the Lukavi-possessed Dystarg, who Ramza then slays. House Beolv falls. Ramza attacks Malonde, the seat of the church, and is forced to give up the scriptures of Germanique. High Confessor Funebris is murdered by Fulmarv and the Templarid. Ramza and co travel to Orban and are transported to the Necrol of Malonde. Ramza fights the transformed Fulmarv, then the resurrected Ultima. Upon her death, there is a massive explosion. Ramza and co are seemingly killed. Ramza and Alma are briefly observed by Oren, but are never seen again. Oren documents the events and drafts the Durai Papers, which he presents to the Clementine Council, during which he is declared a heretic and burned at the stake. Ovilia attacks Delita, who retaliates by killing her. The Durai Papers are suppressed by the church, but discovered by the historian Arazlam. So there are, in fact, two layers of revisionism going on during the narrative of the game. The game's narrative, which I've just summarized, is a revisionist account of the War of the Lions based on the Durai Papers and the hypothetical text left by Ramza I discussed earlier. The second layer of revisionism goes much deeper and involves the truth about the demonic nature of the historic Saint Ajora, and if you want a more in-depth examination of this, have a look at the second video in this series. And it is here that Arazlam would find the greatest degree of pushback. This, again, is sufficient justification for my positing of the unspoken existence of some other historic source, because Arazlam had already published a work titled The True Saint Ajora, the basis of which was, of course, the scriptures of Germanique. So Arazlam's revisionism is a critical re-examination of both a popular historic king and the central figure of the Glabadocian religion. This may seem like an incredibly radical position to take, and perhaps in the broader scope of Evilisen historiography, it is. We are not really told anything about it, other than several of Arazlam's works are considered classics. But how much of a departure is Arazlam's account, really? How the narrative is framed and whose story is the one that gets told and handed down to posterity is vitally important with how modern people come to understand and engage with history. In this vein, historic narratives which center the powerful and the wealthy tends to be the kind of history which is perpetuated and published by the powerful and wealthy. This creates a sense of continuity with the past while obscuring the historic conditions which gave rise to this continuity itself. In other words, establishing a causal link between the elite of the past and the present naturalizes and dehistoricizes the past. It simply becomes the way things were, the way things are, and the way things will be. Fundamentally, perhaps even somewhat regrettably, the text of Final Fantasy Tactics embraces, rather than rejects, the great man theory of history. Arazlam's and our study, in conjunction with the Durai Papers, seeks to revise the historic record in recognition of the central and leading role Ramza Beolv had in the War of the Lions. This is firmly established through in-game dialogue, the mechanics of the game itself, and even the final FMV, wherein Ramza and Alma literally ride off into the sunset while the music swells and the text reads, "But I have found the truth, and so lay it for all to see, that his deeds might guide generations to come, that his name might receive the honor it's due. For all the times Arazlam's stated commitment to the discovery of the truth is presented and repeated, his interpretation of events only challenges specific aspects of the historic narrative, replacing one great man with another. This commitment to historic fidelity is laudable and certainly limited by the narrative nature of the game, but as it turns out, there is yet another layer to the narrative of Final Fantasy Tactics, and one more thing the game has to say about the nature of history. History from below. So the meta-narrative of the game is Arazlam's quest of revealing who the true hero of the War of the Lions was, Ramza Beol. In doing this, his goal was to, of course, discover the historic facts about what happened, and the other was to exonerate his own ancestor, Orin Durai, from the crime of heresy. We are provided a few contextual hints about the apparent age Arazlam himself lives in. We know, for example, that the events occurred some 400 years earlier. While it cannot be said with absolute certainty, given that the War of the Lions is approximated to the Wars of the Roses, which took place in the latter half of the 15th century, the time frame posits Arazlam at some point in the 1840s. The fact that he is dressed in what appear to be heavy robes, utilizes a medieval oil lamp, and a quill pen speak to a degree of historic anachronism, but this may just be for aesthetic purposes. Nevertheless, there simply isn't enough information to make any definitive statements about the state of Ivalice in Arazlam's time period, aside from knowing that publishing has been in place with a sufficient time frame that his previously published works can be considered classics. Arazlam's history, regardless of however revisionist it is, does hold to the great man theory, and this tracks with the proposed hypothetical time frame. What I want to talk about in this section, however, is how despite everything the overall narrative has to say about the mechanism of history, a distinct historic framework reveals itself within the text itself. There is an exchange between Cardinal Delacroix and Ramza once it is revealed that Princess Ovelia has accepted the Church's aid in acceding to the throne. When the Cardinal invites Ramza to join them to change Ivalice for the better, Ramza replies, "I have no wish to change the world, but nor can I stand by while men suffer and die on the whim of some select few. Do you truly believe you can change the world? Not even I am so naive as that." While the purpose of the dialogue is supposed to convey the strength of Ramza's character through his tacit humility, what it actually says is that Ramza alone does not have the ability to change the structure of Ivalicean society. As we witness, by the end of the game, even Delita, the king, has limited control and ability to reshape society as he sees fit. This of course ties back to my examination of the nature of the crown in medieval, and therefore Ivalicean society, and how constrained a king's power really was. But the really important thing, which an examination of both the Orthodox and revisionist history of the War of the Lions reveals, is that it is decidedly not individuals who shape the course of history. Delita's story is quite telling, for as much as he is presented, and presents himself, as this grand manipulator, the Ivalician Machiavelli, it is not through his individual genius, but through the mechanisms of the existing political and social order that he is able to succeed. His manipulation and betrayal at the hands of the Beols, his recruitment as a motivated antagonist against the aristocracy by the Templars and the Church, his planting amongst the forces of Baron Grimms, his function as the protector of the princess, his placement to earn the trust of Duke Goltana, his subsequent assassination of the Duke, and eventual ascension to the crown. All of this was only made possible by the Church, the Template, and of course, the intervention of Ramza. The concept of the people's history, or history from below, as a distinct historiographic framework was something which emerged in Europe in the 1930s, but which would come to be quite dominant in some historical circles beginning in the 1960s, particularly among Marxist historians, figures like Eric Hobsbawm and Howard Zinn. One of the most influential historians to advocate this approach was E.P. Thompson, whose 1963 text, The Making of the English Working Class, was a watershed publication which remains a classic even today. The name itself is quite intuitive. Rather than focusing on great men or the historic genius, the emphasis was placed on the common working people, or, as Thompson put it, I am seeking to rescue the poor stockinger, the Luddite cropper, the obsolete handloom weaver, the utopian artisan, and even the deluded follower of Joanna Southcott, from the enormous condescension of posterity. This approach could also include other lower orders of a society: the dispossessed, the disenfranchised, ethnic minorities, and outsiders, all those who existed on the fringes of the established order. Ramza Beyoğlu, then, while he is the scion of one of the most noble of all the ruling houses of Ivelis, never attains the rank of knight. Not only this, but he also becomes a sellsword and, most significantly, a heretic. The crime of heresy was no laughing matter in the 15th century, as heretics were suppressed and burned at the stake, and the crime of heresy was obviously no less serious in Ivelis. Ramza is branded a heretic for the murder of Cardinal Delacroix, and there are two specific story battles in which he fights against Confessor Zalmor, who is pursuing him so he can be executed as a heretic. So dire is the crime that he is not even afforded a proper Glabadocian burial. I have spoken about it earlier, and as apropos as the job of Ubersquire is, the moniker of Heretic Ramza is perhaps even more appropriate. This branding makes Ramza a pariah, an outsider from Ivalisan society. Even the storied name of Beyoğlu could not protect him from this label. As it turns out, perhaps the significance of Ramza is not that he is the son of Barbaneth, not that he is the last son of House Beyoğlu, and not that he walks the path of the true knight, but something else entirely. No war but class war. There are a handful of lines which occur during every playthrough of Final Fantasy Tactics. You don't have to complete any side quests, complete an errand, or read any supplemental materials to see them, but they are easily lost in the ocean of text required to tell the Zodiac Brave story. They have to do, explicitly, with the fact that Ramza, our hero, is a bastard. Now, I don't mean this in the Argath is a bastard sense either, but in the technical sense of the term as it would have been used in relation to medieval social mores around legitimacy. On his deathbed, Barbaneth's final words to his eldest sons are, Dystarg, Zalbag, you are dear to me, but Ramza is no less so, though he be not the issue of the womb that bore you, my sons, still my blood courses his veins. Watch after him. Just before he transforms into Cuitlin, Cardinal Delacroix gives Ramza a backhanded compliment stating, I see Gafgarian's sword was no match for his words. Then again, perhaps the fault lies with his adversary. Beyoğlu blood is not given to spill easily, even when thinned with that of a courtesan, it would seem. When Ramza travels to Lazalia to inform his brother Zalbag of the High Confessor's plot and questions the character of Dystarg, Zalbag retorts with venom. What have you overdone to inspire my trust? The mistake was my own. Until today I had looked on you as a true brother, but your mother's common blood forever stains you common. You are not fit to bear the Beyoğlu name. After striking the final blow on Ultima's bloody angel form, she remarks with surprise, Impossible, this end to meet. I see it now, too late. In you, his blood, my vanquisher in times long past. But not so soon shall I accept defeat. There is a very apparent feeling of destiny guiding Ramza on his quest to save Ivalice, but what if all of this is a misconception? What if, because of our own preconceived biases around the nature of what it means to be a hero in a medieval setting, especially a fantasy one, obscures what is right in front of us? We are, after all, primed by the very meta-narrative framing of the game towards the traditional sense of what a hero is. We have also been provided with the perspective that what we are witnessing is the truth of the events being presented, given our view exists outside the narrative. There is, after all, the spectre of Barbaneth haunting the fallen state of the Ivalice nobility, Dystar corrupted by his lust for power, Zalbog blinded by his devotion to the church and his name. They are not the true heirs of House Beol. Rather, it is their half-brother Ramza who comes to embody everything a knight ought to be. But what if it isn't the patrilineal Beolf side which guides his hand, but the matrilineal Lugria side? What if it is Ramza's common blood which makes him great? After all, it is Ramza Lugria who makes the fateful decision to save the princess. It is Ramza Lugria who will not stand by and watch as another innocent life is sacrificed for the whims of the nobility, though she be a noble herself. Except Ovilia isn't a noble, or, as far as Fulmarv reveals, not definitively anyways. It is Ramza who forsakes his name to do what is right, and who sacrifices everything to save his sister, thereby saving all of Ivalice in the process. There are of course the words of Bloody Angel, but all she states is that the blood of her former vanquisher flows in Ramza. We are, once again, primed by the influence of Barbaneth and the very foundational mythology of Ivalice to interpret this as meaning an ancestor of House Beolv, but we can just as forcefully assert, and I would argue more forcefully, that the ancestor was of his matrilineal side, his common-born mother. Immediately following the defeat of Adramelech, the Lukavi which emerged from the body of the slain Dystarg, Ramza states, "House Beolv is no more, but what does it matter? We are the sum of our deeds, not our names." If we reflect on the mirrored structure of the narrative, I think we can observe some salient points which emerge not only as a subtext, but within the text itself. Delita is the common-born man who, through ambition and guile, claws his way to the heights of Ivalicean society, becoming the king, the head of the very order which created the conditions for the exploitation of his parents, the murder of his sister, and even his own disposability at the hands of people he trusted. The tragedy at Zichtin taught Delita the cruel realities of the nature of life in Ivalice. There are only those who exploit and those who are exploited. So Delita abandons any semblance of virtue in the pursuit of raw power, at the end of the day, the only thing that truly mattered. Delita sides with the very forces which caused his creation, and it costs him the only person he ever truly loved. Ramza is the highborn son of fortune, his future laid out before him, who after coming face to face with the contradictions of the world he lives in, of the system he has fought to uphold, runs away. He abandons his family, his station, even his name. Yet, when once again faced with the task of upholding the system through the subjugation of the innocent, he resolves the contradiction and sides with the exploited. Ramza sacrifices everything he has to oppose the forces of oppression, and by doing so, is able to save the person he loves. Ramza and Delita start and finish in inverse positions, but it is Ramza the heretic, not Delita the king, who Arazlam posits as the true hero of the War of the Lions. Arazlam cannot, or will not, conceive of history outside the influence of great men, but I would argue that the game shows us something else. Class antagonism, as it turns out, drives history. I mean, Were you expecting any other conclusion from a Marxist? The Zodiac Brave story is, fundamentally, a story about the class struggle in Ivalice. So while it is never more obvious than during the events of Chapter 1, the class antagonism is nevertheless subsumed by Ramza and Delita in the subsequent chapters. There is a scene that takes place in the last third of Chapter 1. Just after you've defeated Maluda for the first time, Ramza asks her if she truly hates the nobility that much. Argoth, in typical fashion, tries to goad Ramza into executing her on the spot, but Delita interjects that he does not see Maluda as chattel. Maluda, for her part, spits at the pity she is being shown, and leaves Ramza with the prescient words, "So long as you bear the name Beolv, you will ever remain an enemy to me. You do well to remember that." Thus, it is only by Ramza abandoning his name, by becoming a class traitor through giving up his own class interests to take a stand against the aristocracy and church, that Ramza is able to take up the struggle of the Corpse Brigade. Ramza, of course, also becomes a sellsword. No longer having his material needs met by his house, he has to sell his combat skills, his labor, in exchange for gil. It is also telling that errands do not become available until Chapter 2, and while they are not necessary, they remain an option, something which was not available while you were a knight apprentice. But what is equally important is that Ramza does not do this alone. As much as solo runs are possible, they are not the intended way the narrative is constructed. Ramza is very much dependent upon the other members of his party, in an ironic way. By shedding his class interest and siding with the exploited, Ramza is finally able to embody the ideals which are supposed to represent everything that is noble. Ramza forswears his rank and spends the remainder of the game fighting in direct opposition to those in power, be they nobles, the church, or even the gods themselves. For as much narrative purchase is given to the threat that Ultima and the Lucavi are supposed to represent, can they really be said to be more oppressive towards the common people than the existing Ivalicean order? Even based on the mythic legends of the Zodiac Braves, the original demon sought to conquer Ivalice, not annihilate humanity. In every way that matters, a character like Maluda, who represents the peasant class, and the character that Ramza becomes once he abandons his name, fights against the interests of the aristocracy, be they mortal or divine, because they understand that at the root, their interests are irreconcilable. In a very real way, then, the central theme of Final Fantasy Tactics can be said to be no war, but class war. Afterword. So this, the fourth video in the series, will bring it to a close. I've spent a lot of my time over the last few months neck deep in all things Ivalice, and, for now, have said most of what I have to say about Final Fantasy Tactics. I hope that this last entry really brought everything together and that it was a satisfying conclusion to the series. I figure I'd save my more contentious takes and interpretations for the last video, so if you felt I made a mistake or stretched a metaphor past the point of credulity, I await your replies in the comments. Now, I guess I should clarify, this is the last proper entry in this series, but as I've been teasing for a while, I will have a fifth and final video coming out after this one. I have some additional thoughts and a few threads which were either too discordant with the theme of each video or felt out of place after a few edits, so it's not going to be a video essay per se, but a miscellany of sorts. And hey, while I have a number of my own ideas, if there are things you think would be interesting to talk about, why not let me know in the comments? I'd also like to thank Jacob Schrum, who was gracious enough to let me use several of his remastered versions of tracks from the Final Fantasy Tactics OST. He's currently working through remastering the whole album, so why not give it a listen? Links can be found in the description below. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, and think it is merited, please give it a like. If you did not, please show your displeasure by giving it a dislike. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I always post my sources in the episode notes, so if you want to follow up with your own reading, it's a good place to start. If you think anyone else you may know would enjoy this video, please share it. You know the grind that is YouTube, and any engagement really does help out a lot. As always, if you like what I do and want to be updated when new content is published, subscribe to the channel. There should also be some links to other videos I've made coming up. Thanks for your time.